All right, Unit 12, Day 5 is even more shifting of trig graphs. This time they're going to give us a description of what's going on. We need to draw the graph and write the equation. All right, on the axes below, graph one cycle of a cosine function with an amplitude of 3, a period of pi over 2, a midline of y equals -1, but it has to pass through the point 0, 2. Write the function. All right, well, I don't know. Some people like to write the function first, some people like to graph it first. We have amplitude, that goes in the function. The midline we know is the vertical shift. The period is the part we got to deal with. It's not the period that goes into the equation, it's the frequency. So we have to use our formula to figure out what the frequency is. So we learned before that period is equal to 2 pi divided by the frequency. So I know the period is pi over 2, so I'm going to fill that in. Pi over 2 is equal to 2 pi divided by the frequency. And now I notice that I have one fraction on each side of my equation, which means if I cross multiply, I can solve for frequency. So frequency times pi is equal to, when I cross multiply the other way, I get 4 pi. Now to get frequency by itself, I divide by the pi. So frequency is equal to 4. And I now have everything I need to write the equation of my graph. So y equals, it said the amplitude was 3, said we have a cosine graph. We just found that frequency is 4, and the midline's -1, which is the shift, so -1. There's our equation. Okay, so now you could use that equation to graph like we did in the previous lesson, or if you wanted to graph from the words, the midline is y equals -1. So I'm going to draw that in. So that now becomes my ground zero, my base. Okay, so I got to mark 1, 2, 3, my 4 critical points. The last one gets labeled with the period because they said one cycle. So the period was pi halves. I label that pi halves. And let's see. This is 1, 2, 3. This is -1, -2, -3. Now it said we had to go through the point 0, 2. Well, cosines start in the air. And my amplitude of 3 means I have to start 3 units above my midline, which happens to be the point 0, 2. So it was just a double checker by giving us that point. So cosines start in the air. So you start up here. Next you go to your midline. And since the amplitude is 3, the next point you're going to go 3 below your midline, which is down here. Then you're going to go back to your ground zero, which is your midline. And then you go back 3 above your midline. And that's how you can graph it without graphing from the equation and then shifting it afterwards. Okay? So you can decide to do it like we did yesterday, or you could do it based on the words. All right. On the axes below, graph one cycle of a sine function reflected through the x-axis. So if it's getting flipped over the x-axis, that's telling me my amplitude is negative. That's what makes it flip. All right, I've got my period, got my amplitude, got my midline. All right, we can graph it right now and write the function afterwards if you'd like. The midline is y equals -3. I think we're going to be off the graph. Oh well. So here's y equals -3. That's your midline. -1, -2, -3, -4. I don't know how far we have to go. Okay, so we have to have 4 critical points. 1, 2, 3, 4. The last one gets the period, so that's 2 pi. And we're ready to graph. Sine graphs always start at 0. Unless, of course, you're shifting. So now that we know what the midline is, the sine graph will always start on the midline because that's our new ground zero. And then amplitude was negative, so instead of going up to a hill, we're going down to a trough. And since the amplitude is 2, that means I go 2 below my midline. So I'm down here at -5 off the graph. Then I go back up to 0. Then I go 2 above my midline. And then I go back to my midline. And there's my graph. Okay, so we could write the equation first and graph it like we did yesterday, or we could just use the information we've got and draw the thing. But now we do have to write the equation. I need the frequency again, so period equals 2 pi divided by frequency. So the period is 2 pi equals 2 pi divided by frequency. Well, if I put that over 1, you probably can tell that the f is going to turn out to be 1 already. But if you cross multiply, you get 2 pi f equals 2 pi. So when you divide by 2 pi, frequency is 1. And yes, if you can realize that the frequency has to be 1 since the period was 2 pi to begin with, you don't have to show any of that work. That's okay. All right, so y equals, said amplitude was negative because it was flipped over the x-axis. Amplitude was 2. It's a sine curve. The frequency was 1. And the midline was -3, so with a shift of -3. There's your equation. On the axes below, graph one cycle of the cos function. It has a period of pi with an amplitude of 2 and a midline of y equals 1. All right, let's draw the graph first. So midline is 1. That's our new ground 0. Period of pi, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Label it pi because that's the period. Amplitude is 2, so we're going up 2 and down 2 from the midline. Cosines start in the air. So I have to start 2 from my amplitude above the midline. So I'm starting at 3. Midline, 2 below midline. Midline, 2 above midline. Connect. Okay. All right, so again, we need the frequency. So period equals 2 pi divided by frequency. They told us the period was pi, so fill that in, put it over 1, cross multiply. Pi times f equals 2 pi, so when you divide by pi, they cancel, and the frequency is 2. So we have everything we need for our function. Y equals, amplitude was 2, trig was cos, frequency was 2, and the midline was a positive 1. There's our function. All right, there's your 3 examples. Good luck. You can choose to write the function first and graph it like we did in the previous lesson, or you can graph it like we did here and write the function after. It really doesn't matter. Good luck.